Cornwall's Arthurian legacy. King Arthur is one of the many Cornish legends that persist almost as historical truth. Although there is no real evidence that he or anyone like him actually had any Cornish connections whatsoever, Arthur's name certainly draws the crowds. At Tintagel Castle, English heritage and the nearby village have now built a whole industry around the Arthurian legend. Without the author, the Welsh cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, including Arthur in his book Historia Regnum Britanniae, better known as the History of the Kings of Britain, this may never have taken place. There is no doubt that Tintagel is an ancient site, and the archaeological discoveries there are of huge importance, including the vast amounts of pottery sherds and artefacts collected. This in itself would have made Tintagel a place of great interest to many attracted to genuine history and archaeology. However, this would probably be insufficient to have allowed for the construction of the original crossing to the island, yet alone the newer bridge now letting thousands more visitors to cross more easily. Of course, the later medieval construction is the real draw, and in the minds of most people this is King Arthur's castle, despite the efforts to tell the real historic truth about it. Cornwall, and those especially connected to Tintagel as a money spinner, such as English heritage and the village, will have a lot to thank a still more overlooked 13th century Earl of Cornwall for. Richard Earl of Cornwall became the owner of the area now occupied by the castle in 1233 through a property deal with the then owner Geoffrey de Tintagel, which included the manor of Merthyr near the Helford River and two other manors. Geoffrey's father, Robert de Hornicott, had changed the family name to de Tintagel. Had he perhaps done this to benefit from Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian story, which had proved so popular? So, who was Geoffrey of Monmouth, who might be termed the father of Arthurian legend, or alternatively Arthurian tourism? Perhaps Tintagel should have a statue to him similar to that close to Tintern Abbey in Monmouthshire. Because of him, both those employed at the castle and benefiting from local tourism have much to be thankful. Geoffrey was born in Wales or along the Welsh marches about 1095, based on the first record of him witnessing a charter in 1129. Before 1135, the earliest existing works known to have been written by Geoffrey are the prophecies of Merlin. Much of his work would have been based on the work of Gildas and his On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain in the 6th century, and Nennius, a 9th century Welsh monk, in his The History of the Britons, along with some Welsh texts existing at that time. Interestingly, there was no mention of Arthur whatsoever by Gildas or Nennius. A third later work by Geoffrey was entitled The Life of Merlin. Geoffrey was consecrated as Bishop of St Affeth in Lambeth in 1152 and had died by December 1155 when his successor took office. Other early authors who made a contribution towards information about Arthur and the period he is assumed to have lived include the famous 8th century monk known as the Venerable Bede. Acknowledged as the father of English history, Bede, in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, named the Battle of Baden Hill, but makes no mention of Arthur. The 10th century Annals Cambrae, the Annals of Wales, also mention Arthur, with the Battle of Mount Baden taking place in AD 518, and Camlan somewhere between 537 and 539, ending with Arthur's death. This places Arthur firmly in the 6th century, if indeed he was an actual historical figure. William of Malmesbury, in his History of the Kings of England, written during the 12th century, mentions Arthur as a war leader, but not a king, and the victor at Mount Baden. The English poet Laomon, in his Chronicles of Britain, written at the end of the 13th century, written in Middle English, was a poem of 16,096 lines narrating the history of Britain. It was based on the works of Wace, which in turn that of Geoffrey of Monmouth. This includes an expanded section relating to the life and exploits of King Arthur. For someone who came from Wales, how is it that Cornwall and Tintagel feature in Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale? It's conceivable that he travelled from South Wales to Cornwall by sea, and if so, why? Geoffrey had dedicated versions of his History of the Kings of Britain to Robert of Carn, 1st Earl of Gloucester. Robert was the eldest, albeit illegitimate, son of Henry I and said to be his favourite. Following Henry's death, he supported his half-sister Maud in her attempt to retain the crown promised to her by her father. This period became known as the Anarchy. A number of manors in Cornwall were owned by Robert, and it may be that through this connection Geoffrey travelled to Cornwall on the Earl's behalf. It was recorded that at the time of Robert's death that the church of Manelly Down, north east of Tintagel, in the manor close by the castle area, had been owned by him. Following the conquest of 1066, this manor had come into the possession of Matilda of Flanders, wife of William I. After her death in 1083, it had reverted to the crown. On the accession of William Rufus in 1087, his younger brother Henry requested the manor, and it was agreed. However, William Rufus went back on his word, and the manor was given to Robert Fitzhamon as part of the honour of Gloucester. When Fitzhamon died, leaving daughters, one of whom, the heiress Mabel, became a ward of Henry, who after gaining control endowed it on his son Robert of Carn. Perhaps Geoffrey in travels to Cornwall may have seen the high cliffs and the remains of earlier occupation and the monastery, now all proven to have existed through 20th century archaeological excavations, and was captivated sufficiently to include them in his story. At the time of writing, there was no recognisable castle from which Geoffrey could have based his history or the birth of Arthur. It has been speculated that some castle building was begun by a younger son of Henry I, also illegitimate, Reginald de Dunsterville, who in due course became Earl of Cornwall about 1140. Reginald was much younger than his half-brother Robert of Carn, and although he may have begun construction at Tintagel, this would have been later than Geoffrey's work. Was Reginald, on becoming Earl of Cornwall, inspired to start building a castle by Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain, completed just a few years earlier? Certainly the archaeologists Radford Raleigh, who carried out excavations during the 1930s, considered the earlier medieval work was undertaken by Reginald, and that even the earlier buildings related to a Celtic monastery. Recent archaeological work at Tintagel has discovered far more about the site, and reference to any possible work by Reginald de Dunsterville seems to have been pushed into the background or omitted. All the medieval buildings now existing have been attributed to Richard Earl of Cornwall, Reginald's great-great-nephew. If Reginald de Dunsterville and later Richard Earl of Cornwall wanted to create a Cornish agenda linking themselves to King Arthur, they were not the only ones. Many later kings would also create connections, including Edward I, who was a great Arthurian enthusiast, and it was he who built the Round Table, now hanging in Winchester Great Hall. The Tudors, trying to create some authenticity to their reign, saw Henry VII naming his eldest son Arthur, and Henry VIII restoring the Great Table and including the Tudor rose at its centre. It has been suggested that the actual name of Tintagel, or in its earliest form, Tintogel, was actually an invention by Geoffrey. However, with certain Cornish elements to the name, perhaps it was a Latinised, misheard or misspelt version of the Cornish Dintagel, din being fort and tagel meaning choke point. Perhaps some artistic licence by Geoffrey was involved, and it has never been found recorded before he wrote it. Cornish author and historian Craig Weatherhill believes that it is of Norman French origin, from Tentdegel, meaning the devil's stronghold. Other places mentioned by Geoffrey in Cornwall include the fort of Demilio. The paragraph mentioning Tintagel and Demilio in the history of the kings of Britain reads, "But Goilois did not dare to meet him because his number of armed men was less. Wherefore he chose to fortify his towns until he had obtained help from Ireland, and being more anxious for his wife than for himself, he placed her in the town of Tintagel on the shores of the sea, which he considered a safe refuge. But he himself entered the fort of Demilio, lest, if misfortune should happen, they should both perish at the same time. The hill fort that is now the site of the church of St Denis at St Denis is a popular location for Demilio, which was once part of the manor of Dimhilioch, an ancient Iron Age site. The stories we know today include many additions to the original Arthurian history written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. The medieval poet Robert Wace expanded on Geoffrey's Arthurian-related work, completing his own entitled Roman de Brut in 1155. Chrétien de Troyes, a French poet, added many more characters we know today to the wider legend, including Lancelot, Percival, Gawain, and introducing the Holy Grail. Whereas Geoffrey may have aimed for his work to be a historic record, Chrétien de Troyes is certainly a romanticised fiction, and he is often credited as being the inventor of the modern novel. Later poetic works by Sir Thomas Malory in the 15th century, Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate in the 19th century, and even the Vicar of Morwenstow, the Reverend Stephen Hawker of Trelawney fame, added to the spread of this growing tale and legend. Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain was acknowledged as a genuine history well into the 16th century, but now accepted as an important piece of medieval literature rather than a history. The basis of many films, television series, theatre performances and art, the Arthurian story is a great one, and Cornwall has managed to hang on to its slice of that valuable cake. The question of who Arthur was and did he really exist has been the subject of numerous books over the centuries, with many differing thoughts and conclusions. That there was a powerful Celtic Briton war leader who fought the Saxons is accepted by most academics. Who he was, perhaps we will never know. Personally, one of my favourite theories is through the Proto-Celtic word arto, meaning bear. This was perhaps a nickname for someone big and powerful and well known and recorded from that time in history. Later, Arto was transformed into Arthur, and his real name and nickname have never been clearly linked.